All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Today we'll be sharing the details of a study we're working on with the Danone Ecosystem Fund to quantitatively assess the impact of a business called Semilla. In this study, we're evaluating the impact on Semilla salespeople who sell yogurt door-to-door in Mexico City. Specifically, we're measuring the effects of employment at Semilla, which includes the effect of formal benefits that the salespeople receive, such as access to health care, child care, discount card for purchases, and a housing fund, among other benefits. It also includes trying to assess the effect of the training they receive on sales and life skills, such as nutrition, finances, such as budgeting, managing money, as well as communication skills. And it will also assess the general effects of working at a formal job, which includes and can include social support of coworkers and having an advisor. Before getting into the quantitative methods we're using to assess Semilla's impact, I'm going to quickly recap key takeaways from the first and second webinar in this series to help set the context for today's call. As discussed on our first webinar, we believe that there are three components of capturing a multidimensional view of poverty. One is including the voice of all local stakeholders in your assessment, from headquarters staff to smallholder farmers, or in this case, salespeople. Two is moving beyond economic measures and including other types of well-being outcomes, such as capability and relationship well-being. And three is assessing positive and negative changes. In our second webinar, we talked about how to qualitatively assess your multidimensional impact on poverty by conducting a strategic analysis. The purpose of a strategic analysis is to gain a holistic understanding of a venture's impacts and to prioritize these impacts based on magnitude, meaning how large of an effect the impact has on stakeholders, and likelihood, meaning how likely is the impact to occur. As we discussed, the findings from this phase can be used to inform action in order to improve the business model. Say your findings from the strategic analysis phase show your ventures having little to no impact, or even a negative impact on your seller's self-efficacy. Finding this information allows you to develop strategies to change this. Although you can stop at the strategic analysis phase, you may want to move into the performance analysis phase if you need to quantify the effect of only your program. The performance analysis phase will be the focus of today's call. This quantitative phase can incorporate varying levels of robustness depending on what you want to prove. The level of resources needed and what you can and can't say about the data depend on a number of decisions you make in this phase, such as whether you want to include a comparison group, the length and type of survey, such as self-administered or interviewer-administered, the process for data collection, including whether you want to collect the data yourself or have a third party do so. Obviously, we can't cover all the details to consider when making such decisions in our call today, so we're going to show you how we apply the methodology to a specific project, in this case, Semilla. And during our workshops, we go into detail regarding the pros and cons of each of these elements, and attendees leave with a customized action plan for conducting both a strategic analysis and a performance analysis. So not only are the findings of either the strategic analysis and performance analysis meant to inform future business plans and innovation, but also can inform future evaluation measures. During the performance analysis, managers may identify impacts they want to explore more deeply qualitatively and therefore may decide to conduct an additional strategic analysis. You can find the recording of our first and second webinar on YouTube for more details on the strategic analysis and measuring multidimensional poverty. Before we move into the performance analysis phase, I want to briefly share how we conducted the strategic analysis for this project as it informs our performance analysis phase, which we'll be talking about today. At a high level, we first conducted background research to identify a set of holistic potential impacts and conducted qualitative interviews in person to add to and refine the list and then analyze this data to prioritize the impacts. I'm not going to go over the details of these methods here as they were discussed in our last webinar, but this slide is meant to be a reference slide. So after this webinar, all three webinar videos will be available for you to review. For our on-site visit, we aim to hear from a range of stakeholders to triangulate findings. So this is a list of who we talked to when we were in Mexico City doing the strategic analysis. During our visit, we also made sure we talked to people who are hard to find, such as ex-salespeople, because we knew that they likely have a different perspective than those that are still working at Semilla. We also talked to supervisors, people in the local office, as well as at the headquarter office, partners of Semilla, etc. We came up with the following set of prioritized impacts within each area of well-being based on our analysis of each impact's magnitude and likelihood of occurrence. These variables include changes resulting from receiving a stable source of income, such as changes in income, their perception of income stability, savings, economic independence, status in home, and their status in the community. It also includes expected changes resulting from the types of training salespeople receive. For example, trainings on communication, such as learning how to better talk with your partner and children, could result in changes in parenting behavior, or psychological violence, and or empowerment. Now that we have a set of prioritized impact variables, we're going to turn our attention to the performance analysis phase and how to quantify these impact variables. Quantifying these impact variables requires conducting a survey with your target population, and in this case that's our salespeople, to assess the change in the prioritized impacts over time. But before you can survey the key stakeholder, the salespeople, you need to develop your research design, which includes the what, when, how, and who of measuring your impact. The what includes, what are you measuring? We conducted further literature reviews on each of the prioritized impacts in the previous slide in order to gain a better understanding of each construct and how to measure it. For example, empowerment is a complex variable that can be measured in many different ways, and we needed to better understand experts' thoughts on measuring the construct. In the end, we decided to capture both changes in empowerment in the workplace as well as changes in empowerment at home. After the strategic analysis phase, we also conducted additional research to finalize the how, the who, and the when of our research design, which I'll get into in a moment. At the same time, we also began planning the logistics of data collection, including the timing of when we would begin data collection and how and when we pre-test and pilot the survey in order to adapt the survey to the local context. We also began to think about who would conduct the surveys. For this project, we decided to have a third party conduct these surveys. We came to this conclusion as it was important for Danone Ecosystem Fund and WDI that the results would not be biased from having internal Semilla staff collect the data, since salespeople might have felt pressure to answer questions in certain ways if their supervisor or someone else they knew conducted the interview. We also decided to use a local third party because they are more familiar with the context, including the language and customs, than our Ann Arbor-based team. As mentioned earlier, our research question was to understand the effect of Semilla employment on salespeople. For the Danone Ecosystem Fund, it was really important to understand what would have happened to the people if they hired, what would have happened to the people they hired if Semilla never existed. Therefore, we needed to include a comparison group to create a counterfactual. That is, what salespeople would have experienced in the absence of Semilla. If we didn't include a comparison group, we wouldn't know if the changes resulted only from Semilla or Semilla and some external events such as a new government policy or a natural disaster. For this project, we decided not to randomize the sample for a number of reasons. Mainly, Semilla is a business, and they're not interested in hiring as many new salespeople as possible, and thus it was not, they are interested in hiring as many new salespeople as possible, and thus it wasn't in their business's best interest to create a wait list of qualified salespeople to hire at a later date. They would rather just bring them on board right away. Therefore, to ensure the comparison and treatment group were as similar as possible before the intervention, we conducted a baseline. Doing so allows us to control away for any differences that exist at baseline between the comparison and treatment groups despite our best efforts. We interviewed salespeople and the comparison group at time 0, and then again using the same survey to assess changes in the prioritized impact variables 6 weeks later for each group. And in our analysis, we'll compare the differences between the groups at endline. In order to help the comparison and treatment group, in order to help ensure that the comparison and treatment group were as similar as possible at baseline, we used the same set of filters Semilla uses to recruit salespeople in selecting our comparison group. We added additional filters to help ensure these groups were similar, such as not including anyone not employed and not looking for work, because people not looking for work are likely to differ in motivation. After setting selection filters, we used a power calculation to assess how many people we would need in our comparison group at endline to be likely to find a change if it existed. I won't go into the specifics of this calculation here, because we get into that in our workshops. However, at a high level in our calculation, we used an effect size of around 0.3, which means we'll be able to detect small effects. We also use a power of 0.9, meaning we have a 90% chance of finding a statistically significant difference when there is one, and an alpha of 0.05, which means that less than 5% of the difference we find is solely due to chance. Once we had the number of people we needed at endline to be likely to find a change if it existed, we then worked backwards to figure out how many people we need to interview at baseline, given that we wouldn't be able to likely find everyone again at endline due to attrition, since some people may move or maybe don't want to conduct another interview. Now I'm going to talk about the treatment group. We decided to interview Semilla salespeople on the first day that they're hired at Semilla, as their training starts immediately after their interviews with Semilla are completed, and therefore they begin to receive what we're calling the Semilla effect, which we're trying to measure. Similar to the comparison group, we also conducted a power calculation for the treatment group to determine the necessary sample size for the treatment group. In determining how many people to interview at baseline to reach this number, we took into account both attrition, which is our ability to find people again, as well as the fact that not everyone who starts at Semilla will stay at Semilla for 6 weeks. Some may stop working for Semilla like for personal reasons, while others may be let go. Now Yaquta is going to talk about how we developed the survey to measure the prioritized impact variables.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks everyone for joining us. We really appreciate your time. So my name is Yaquta Fatehi, and I'm going to take you through the activities that we conduct in the performance analysis phase of this project. What you see here on your screen is a high-level overview of all the activities that we are conducting. First, what I want to draw your eye to is the survey development subphase, which includes designing and testing of the survey. Next is the data collection subphase, which includes piloting the survey, and then of course the meat of the data, which is your baseline and endline. That's followed by the data analysis, and finally the reporting phase, where we report out to Danone Ecosystem Fund on our findings from the study, as well as recommendations to improve Semilla. Now we are currently in the baseline and endline phases, so we won't be sharing anything about data analysis or reporting phases on this call today. And another thing I just want to quickly say is that the way we've designed these slides, as well as the upcoming ones, is that they provide a list of activity points that you should consider when you do a similar kind of study and are in a similar phase. And that's why the language and the grammar that are presented in the slides are in present tense, versus I will be speaking in past tense, since we have already completed a lot of these activities. Now, moving into the survey development phase. Next slide, please. Let's get into the details of survey development. In a nutshell, what we have learned after doing this multiple times in multiple projects is that to get a strong, good survey requires a lot of time and effort. We looked for existing survey measures or instruments, or if you call them batteries, it's the same thing, to accurately measure our prioritized indicators that Heather showed you. We only created questions when none were found in existing literature or studies, and these new questions were reviewed by survey experts before we took them to the field. To find existing measures, what we did is we conducted an extensive search looking for instruments in not just development publications such as those from the World Bank, but also in psychology science publications. Now, especially for instruments that measure self-efficacy, self-confidence, role in the family, interaction with children, etc., we really looked at psychology publications. Now, the reason we use existing instruments is that we wanted each of our questions to have both reliability and validity. Now, what do these two constructs mean? Reliability ensures that our questions were being consistently understood by each and every respondent, and the process to answer those questions were the same for each person during that time period. That's reliability. Now, validity ensured that the question measured what we intended it to measure. And because tests for reliability and validity can be complicated, we use pre-existing measures that have already been testing for these two constructs. So this way we're saving time and effort, and we're not reinventing the wheel. Now, also note that we did review that the instruments were used in Mexico, or at least with similar populations that had low income, similar education levels, etc. Now, we also developed an informed consent form, as well as a very strong introduction section in the survey itself, which informed respondents that their answers are confidential and they will not be shared with any outside organizations such as the government, that they can stop the survey whenever they wish to, they can say no to answering a particular question, and that the survey is not part of the recruitment process at Semilla. Our surveys were implemented by interviewers, and these were face-to-face meetings. Now, in our survey, we ordered sections logically and kept sensitive questions at the end. Our goal was to build a rapport and allow the respondent to feel comfortable throughout the survey. We also added many interviewer notes to remind the interviewer that he or she should be sensitive towards the respondent and not judge the respondent on their answers. We put in verbal cues that are read to the respondents, such as, this information will not be shared with anyone. We use skip patterns such that we don't ask any question which is not applicable. And we also had visual aids on our Likert scale, and you can find an example of this in the annex. So looking at the variables collected and the number of questions, here, all the variables that are being collected on can be found on your screen. The number in the brackets is the number of questions for each variable. For the baseline, we have a total of 125 questions, which we are able to ask within 60 minutes, which is the recommended survey length by experts. We have a very strong set of qualitative questions that allow us to capture anecdotes, stories, and basically stuff that quantitative questions cannot capture. In the N-line survey, we have most of the questions are similar, except there is a separate set of qualitative questions that we ask salespersons who are still at Semilla, and a separate set of questions for salespersons that left Semilla. And we did this so that we could capture the different experiences that the women were having. Now, moving into the pretest phase, once the survey was ready on paper, we pre-tested it. The pretest is very important and is designed as cognitive interviews. We conducted 24 interviews in total, and we tested them with both treatment and comparison group respondents to understand how they would answer the questions. Now, what this means is that we tested the questions by asking the respondents what a question meant to them and how they would respond to it. We then also asked them why would they respond in that manner. Sometimes even single words can make a difference. One such example is we use the words marital status in the demographics section, but in the pretest we learned that it is more sensitive to ask it as, what is your civil status? We also use the pretest to test the order of the questions in the survey, as well as to test overall logistics and protocols. Now, the findings from the pretest were then used to update the survey to ensure that our target population interpreted the questions as we intended them to. We changed questions words to adapt it to Mexican culture. For example, we learned that certain words in English can have a neutral meaning in English, of course, but they have a negative connotation in Mexican Spanish or vice versa. And again, after making our revisions, we consulted an external expert. Now, moving into the pilot phase, In addition to the pretest, we conducted a pilot. Sometimes in some studies you'll find that these are merged together. We used that pilot as the final opportunity to test the updated survey in its entirety, as well as all logistics and protocols with both the treatment and comparison groups. So you have to think of the pilot as a dry run for all parties involved before the actual baseline begins. Now, prior to the pilot, we worked with our data collection partner to have the updated survey revised into Spanish. We went down to Mexico City for the pilot as well and trained our interviewers on the updated survey and then began interviews. Now, we oversaw many treatment and comparison group interviews. When any of our interviewers looked confused or asked us a question, we were right there in the mix to answer it in real time, and we found that this was very valuable to be able to clear a doubt immediately. We debriefed after each interview, we revised the survey sheets, we went with the interviewers to the marketplaces to recruit the comparison group persons, and on a whole got a really thorough understanding of how the baseline would proceed. Now, post-interviews, our data collection partner sent us the survey data, and using that data, we checked the reliability of the questions through the Cronbach alpha calculations, as well as reviewed the variation in responses. Now, we have some slides on this in the annex, so you can take a look at that after the webinar. And finally, we updated the survey one last final time before we moved into the baseline. So our baseline began in May, and we are in the 11th week of data collection. Because Semilla only hires a certain number of salespersons per week and the endline is conducted 6 weeks after baseline, our endline is actually overlapping with our baseline. So just before our baseline began, we retrained interviewers to ensure a smooth baseline. In the training, we did 2 types of exercises, and both included role play. And we can get into the details of the trainings, if you like, during the Q&A session. We also oversaw the first 2 days of the baseline in the micro depots, which means we did go back to Mexico. And we did this with both comparison as well as treatment group interviews. Now, post-interviews, we asked each interviewer if they had any questions and also looked through their surveys to find any discrepancies. We checked in with each one of them if they had given the thank you gift that we had decided we wanted to give. Now, the endline began on 18th of June, and during this whole process, we have weekly calls with our third-party data collection partner. We receive the baseline and endline databases weekly, and we analyze these in 2 ways. First, we check whether the comparison group is similar to the treatment group, and secondly, we do a quality check on the data, and we look out for any missing variables. A third kind of analysis we will soon begin doing is to check the endline results and compare them to the baseline results for each cohort of the sample. And finally, the last slide, what I want to show you on this slide is the variety of challenges we have faced when conducting such quantitative studies, including the Semilla one, and what we've also heard from other groups that do these kinds of studies. Now, I won't read out what's on the screen, but we do address each of these challenges in our workshops that Heather mentioned. And finally, we have some excellent information in the annex, and we really hope you will take a moment and review these once you get the slides. I'm going to turn back to Jean-Christophe, who's going to talk more in particular about the studies that Danone Ecosystem Fund are conducting. Thank you again for your time, and we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.